Hi, everybody. I'm back and want to talk this week again about another invasive medicinal plant or opportunistic plant that grows invasively in some parts of the world, but is also great medicine. This will probably be the last one I do in this little series of plants that are invasive and also medicine, because I've got a lot of other plants I want to get to, but it's right behind me here, and I'll do some B-roll, some close-up of it so you can see while I'm talking. I probably should wait until it's flowering so you can see the flower, but I just wanted to kind of get all these plants that are sort of what we call invasive plants done around the same time, so they're all kind of in one segment here. And so I'm not doing it while it's flowering. This is honeysuckle, Japanese honeysuckle. So most of you watching this probably have seen or are familiar with honeysuckle and the honeysuckle flower in general. Different species. This is Lonicera japonica, but there's many different species all around the world. Now, most of these species are medicinally analogous and used fairly similar in cultures that use them. This comes to us more also again from TCM, traditional Chinese medicine, a lot of the medicinal stuff that's being used. But it relates, this is funny, it relates again to most of the other medicinals I've shown you that are invasive species and from TCM that are used, that I grow here. And it's not because I meant to do this, it's just they are. This is another one that clears toxic heat, which means, in a TCM sense, which means it translates very well over to plants that we can use for viral and bacterial infections, really bad bacterial infections even. And again, the upper respiratory tract is where I use this plant. Now back to the invasive thing, I just want to say briefly, before I get to the medicinal part of this plant, you can see how it's growing and it's taken over this part of my fence here, and it's starting to finally kind of flourish and grow into the garden because I've cut back other things that were competing with it. But it's been like years. I don't know how many, 6, 7, 8 years that it's been here, and it's just in the last year has even started doing this, and it's not that big a deal. There are plants, so when somebody tells you this is an invasive species, it depends entirely upon the ecoregion that it's growing in. This one isn't going to take anything over other than this little area of good soil that I've got right here and some of the areas that are cut back. Otherwise, it doesn't have a chance against some of the other native species here. So, it's such a misnomer, I think, to always say, hey, this plant's invasive. It doesn't mean that it's invasive everywhere. That said, this is considered a big problem in some parts of the world. All right, let's get into the medicine of this plant. The part of this plant that we want to use really is the flower. Now we can use the leaf, we can even use the stem, the bark of the stem, which is a vine. But the part that we really want is the flower. And it's a gold flower on this Japanese honeysuckle that then turns kind of a silverish almost as it ages. In fact, that's the name. The TCM name is Jinyinhua, which is gold silver flower, I believe. And that describes this flower when we want to harvest it is really during the initial part of when it's first starting to turn into a flower, from a bud to a flower. That's, in my opinion, about the best time to harvest it. But any time in those first, because the flowers are gonna come out, bud, and blossom, and come out all over the plant at different times. So if you get some that are 2 or 3 days old and some that are the first day they're coming out, it's kind of mixed all within there. Even the first week, anytime in there, you want to harvest those flowers. Then what I do is I dry them. So I put it all together and I just dry it. And then I do an alcohol perk of this at 95% or 90% first, and then I do a water decoction, and I put in glycerin and honey into that water decoction. And what I do is a multifractional, and the reason for that is that it gives a much better final quality of medicine when you do a multifrac than just doing an alcohol tincture. Or there are other ways to prepare this in the traditional Chinese medicine manner that include frying it and some other things that I've never tried. I don't know, and there may be there probably is an entirely new world of medicine making looking into that at some point that I'll get into. But all I've worked with here has been as a multifractional. Now, the reason I do alcohol first really is there's a couple of constituents in here that I want to get out. And one of them is chlorogenic acid. Chlorogenic acid we find also, for instance, in green coffee before it's roasted. This is something that we find as a really good hyaluronidase inhibitor, which is interesting. Hyaluronidase is one of the enzymes that we find, for instance, in venomous bites, like snake bites. And so we find that hyaluronidase inhibition, such as from Echinacea angustifolia root, are very effective in slowing down the venom and slowing down the damage that the venom can do to the body. Well, here again, we come back to this toxic heat. The venomous bite or venomous sting, or in Chinese medicine, an abscess or any kind of heat or boil, that would be a toxic heat. Very similar. So there's a lot of comparisons here that are very similar. And I didn't come into this from the Chinese medicine side. I came to this from my own research. And chlorogenic acid is one of the herbs that one of the constituents that I've used. Another one that's in here is luteolin, which is found also, guess what, in yerba santa, which has been really interesting in some studies using it to be able to reduce the inflammation, the inflammasome activity of COVID-19. So this is one of the reasons that I was working with yerba santa as one of the major ingredients in some of my formulas, depending on what stage of COVID that a person was in. Found great success with that, and this is the same case. So we have these constituents that would be great to get out, and I would prefer to get them out with alcohol first and then go to the water. That's why I do it in that order in this particular plant. So clears toxic heat. The plants that we would use this for upper respiratory tract infections, for viral infections. That can be cold, that can be flu. It goes really well in tradition with forsythia, for instance, for things like upper respiratory tract viral infections, especially at the onset. But that could go all the way to something that's much deeper, or something that's even bacterial. It's probably, arguably, a biofilm buster. We can use it with things like Baikal skullcap, and with even depending on our delivery system, with something that has berberine in it, like our algarita or Oregon grape, or any of our anti-infectives that way. If we can use it for the gut that way as well, for something like a biofilm, as a biofilm inhibitor, probably. This isn't something I have a lot of clinical experience with, this particular plant that way, but my suspicion is that it absolutely could be used that way. The flower also arguably has antifungal qualities to it for topical application, but between that and also its biofilm busting capabilities, it makes it a really good candidate for formulation that you might want to use for intranasal administration, whether through atomizer, whether through neti pot, whether even through nausea oil, where you're working with somebody with maybe chronic sinus infections that oftentimes are either fungal or biofilm based. So my point is, you can formulate it and use it with any number of different herbs, depending on what direction you're trying to go with in the respiratory tract in particular, right? Whether it's gumweed or thyme or yerba santa or yerba mansa, or any of these herbs that we're using for either anti-infective or to support the mucosa, like mallow, for instance, or anything that we're looking towards to supporting the terrain, supporting the lymph and the immune system, being directly antiviral, being directly antibacterial, being a biofilm buster. There's all these different categories, and this works very well on as that anti-infective part, whether direct or indirect, but very strongly anti-infective part, I find, in a formula. So overall, it's a great plant to have around, and easy to grow, but again, checking on your own ecosystem to make sure that you don't want to have to deal with an invasive, the invasive quality that it can do when it starts to take over your garden or take over an area pretty well. That's something to just bear in mind. But otherwise, incredible kind of a hedge. I think of it as a good hedge vine, and I love having vines anyway that are medicine anywhere around in my own yard. Okay, that's what I had to say about Lonicera japonica, or Jinyanhua, or Japanese honeysuckle, depending on which name you want to use. And we'll talk to you next time around, next weekend. I'm not sure what plant I'm gonna hit, but I think we'll move into some of the other stuff that's not necessarily invasive or opportunistic, but is incredible medicine that grows either in my garden or in the hill country region or other places all around the country.